In my opinion, one of the great lost treasures of modern music is Chaka Khan's second solo album called Naughty that was released on March 26, 1980. Chances are you've probably never heard of it. There weren't a ton of popular songs on it. It didn't get very high on the charts. Or maybe you're like me and you know the album very well and are absolutely devoted to it. There is magic on Naughty that I can't begin to describe to you. The session musicians she was able to assemble for this date, along with producer Arif Mardin, created something magical that somehow slipped through the cracks because of the timing of when the record was released. Today, I want to talk about the greatness of this album, along with the great bass players who were involved in the recording of it, what gear they might have used when applicable, and my favorite part, I'm going to attempt to break down these wonderful bass lines and recreate them for you so that we can take a look at them. There's a reason that incredible musicians like Marcus Miller and Nathan East both consider this album to be one of their essential bass records to hear. So join me and let's dig into the lost arc of bass playing with Naughty. We start out the album with the very great Anthony Jackson on the bass. If you look up Naughty on Wikipedia, the name right underneath Chaka Khan's is Anthony Jackson, and it's for good reason. This album is his tour de force. It's his Mona Lisa, his perfect game. Anthony is at the peak of his creative style, and what he's doing on the bass, you'll never hear of before this album, and chances are after it. He's doing amazing things. Now, his association with Chaka Khan goes back to her first album, Chaka, from 1978. They also recorded together on the Quincy Jones album, Sounds and Stuff Like That, from the same year. For the session, he used his very famous Career Girl Fender Jazz bass, which has been modified with a 1975 jazz body and a 1973 Fender Precision neck. The sessions for this album also fall around the same time as sessions he recorded for Paul Simon's One Trick Pony, and chances are he was also involved with the sessions for Steely Dan's Gaucho around the same time. Anthony's story with this album is amazing. He went in like any good session musician to lay down his tracks and wasn't initially happy with what he had done. So producer Arif Mardin asked him if he wanted more time, and he did something that no producer has ever done before. In Anthony's words, Naughty, which was recorded in New York in 1979, went on without concern for the bass tracks. I was given absolute artistic license, with one exception and an unheard of amount of time, 3 months, to recompose the bass parts, whereupon I notified producer Arif Mardin of my readiness to record. I was given all the studio time that I required. I never found out how much my indulgence cost Chaka, but the end result is as pure an example as exists in my own case of the ends justifying the means. 3 months. He had 3 months to take these songs home and come up with something brilliant, and all the time he needed in the studio. What the end result is that he's talking about is a masterwork. Everything is perfect pop bass playing at the highest level. You should know that Anthony didn't play a 5 or a 6 string at this point. He had developed the instrument, the contrabass guitar, the 6-string bass, in 1975 with Carl Thompson. He had a couple of prototypes already. He was in between his second and third, but he didn't have a reliable instrument that he felt comfortable bringing on gigs and sessions quite yet. Ken Smith would fill that void about a year later, but until then, he was playing a 4-string tuned down to drop C tuning. C, F, B flat, E flat. Still in fourths, but it sounded thunderous. I considered doing this for the video, but you have to make a lot of alterations to your bridge, your truss rod, and your nut in order to make that happen. But it did teach me a lot about how Anthony executed these lines. Some of them lay really great in that tuning. So for the purposes of this video, and so that you might be able to cop some of these bass lines, I'm just going to play all of Anthony's lines on a standard MTD6. Let's get into it. This track is amazing. C minor, caters to his open key. It'll go down to our first fret if you're playing a 5 or a 6. The sound of the song is based on the C blues scale, which you're hearing right at the beginning of the song, in that unison with the bass and the cellos. Now, Ashford and Simpson wrote this song kind of as their follow-up to I'm Every Woman, the huge hit that they had off of Chaka Khan's first record. Now, something not everybody knows about this song is that a very young 16-year-old named Whitney Houston, along with her mother Sissy, sang backup vocals on this track. That's right, Whitney Houston sang backup on Chaka's record. Now, Anthony alternates this really incredible style where he's playing these flourish lines with a pick and then going into a fingerstyle thing. The key here is note length, the way he bounces. This, in my opinion, made Anthony the greatest disco player ever. He had a way of playing quarter notes that wasn't totally short and staccato and that wasn't totally long and legato. It was somewhere in the middle. Also of note is the great Steve Ferrone on drums from the Average White Band. Steve Ferrone plays on the whole record with all these bass players, and he makes every single one of them sound amazing. Bassist number 2, the great Willie Weeks. One of the most diverse, widely recorded, and definitely unheralded bass players that we've ever known. His resume up to this point already included records with Donny Hathaway, Stevie Wonder, George Harrison, James Taylor, and many others. In fact, within the next year after recording this record, he would join the Doobie Brothers. His connection with Chaka Khan actually predates her in the group Rufus. Willie Weeks played bass for the group Ask Rufus before they became Rufus and then added Chaka Khan as their vocalist. His main acts for years has been a gorgeous 1962 Fender Precision bass. But for the money, some of these recordings, I'm pretty sure that he's playing his 1964 jazz. Let's check it out. Interesting discovery breaking this song down. It's a blues. I never realized that before. Now, this is what little of synthesizer you'll really notice on the record, and they decided to double the bass, which would become a trend going forward into the 80s. What I really love is the interplay that occurs between the bass guitar, the synth bass, and one of the rhythm guitars, which is played down low, so it's almost like a high bass is happening. There's a point in the song where you can't tell who is playing what fill, and it's really clever. And this is just a great groove. Now, if you're familiar with this song, this is actually the third recorded version of it. Barry White's Love Unlimited did a version of it in the early 70s, followed by a Dionne Warwick version. But in my opinion, this is hands down the best one. This is the master stroke of the record. If I had to pick one track where Anthony is at the peak of his prowess, it would be this track. This bass line is so amazing and composed, and what he's doing can't even be described. Take special note of the way that Anthony plays with space. He uses a lot of space. He knows how to leave a lot of space, and he knows how to fill it up when he needs to. This is a line worth studying. And for those that know, I'm not even going to talk about the E flat lick that happens towards the end of the song.
Just love me, baby. Just love me, baby. Just love me, baby.
So first of all, the chord is this E flat sus, which is, the sus chord is like the official chord of Naughty. But he sets up a vamp, playing all this incredible space. And then he comes out of nowhere with slowed down, in case you want to check it out, is just amazing. Now on this track, it's almost like Anthony Jackson is paying tribute to his hero, and that would be the great James Jamerson of Motown fame. We hear Jamerson's blueprint all over this song, the way that Anthony is approaching his rhythm, the way he's playing through changes, the way that he's flourishing and carrying the groove. This is pure and simple Jamerson if I've ever heard it.
Nothing's gonna take you away. Nothing's gonna take you away. Nothing's gonna break your heart.
And let's all give thanks to the late great Michael Brecker for playing an amazing solo. How often do we get to hear that anymore? And hold out the note that segues us into the next song. How cool is that? Are you ready to have your mind blown? At this point, Marcus Miller is 19 or 20 years old. He's a teenager, and he's playing his butt off. After being brought into the session world by percussionist Ralph McDonald, Marcus Miller's career took off. At this point, he's playing his 1977 Fender Jazz bass, but it sounds like there are no preamps or anything. This is his bass, passive straight into the board. In the year 1979 alone, Marcus had already been in the studio with Elton John at this point. He made his first record in a long collaboration with saxophonist David Sanborn, and he also played on the soundtrack of the motion picture Fame. What he's playing here is pretty hot. I mean, what can I say about Marcus? He's a bad dude. Even as a teenager, right away we get his trademark, although listen to the first verse and you'll hear he was a bad fingerstyle player as well. holding back here. There's a lot of rhythm, a lot of in the crack stuff going on, whether it's octaves, the triplet figure that happens right away. He's a gunslinger. He's taking chances and he's getting in there and getting his hands dirty. The coolest thing about this is we can hear Marcus evolve. I think if Marcus had played on this track 3 or 4 years later, we would hear a much sleeker version of Marcus, but unbridled. He's really going for it. I wish I played like this at age 19. Also, note how up front the bass is. Keeping it in the family, Chaka brings on her brother. Now, Mark Stevens is no slouch. The man is a vocalist, songwriter, producer, and multi-instrumentalist who more than holds his own on this record. Now, there's not a lot of information online about Mark Stevens. He wasn't in the limelight for that long, but he did share the stage with Marcus Miller and drummer Lenny White in the R&B band The Jamaica Boys, where he wrote, produced, played multiple instruments, and sang. He was a bad dude. Now the first thing I hear when I hear this track is disco. This is dance music. But it is totally grooving hard, and I love it. And there's 2 bass players playing simultaneously. In that Anthony quote, he mentioned he had to compromise on one line. I'm thinking this was the line, maybe, that he had to keep it much more simple. He had to follow direction instead of composing something because Mark Stevens was going to come in and add the plucks over his line. But dig it, we still get all those elements of the great Anthony Jackson. Those bouncing quarter notes, note length precisely on, and it's just grooving like crazy. Now, there's really not much to this song at all. But on the sly, this could be the baddest bass playing on the record. It's incredible what Anthony does with this. He takes a very minimalistic staccato groove, and then he adds these gorgeous fills every 4 or 8 bars that totally blow your mind. Also of note is the incredibly experimental aspect of this whole record. It's featuring instrumental music, but Chaka and Arif Mardin are taking chances. And on this song, there's a violin solo. A violin solo on a pop record. This type of playing, we really get the soul of AJ. He's locked deep into the pocket, and then when it's time to comment, he says something nobody else ever would. Thank you, Anthony. The first thing I'm hearing right away is that slapping on a precision bass. You're really getting the front pickup, so I dialed it all the way to my front pickup to try to get that vibe. Really thick, buttery. Now, Mark Stevens co-wrote this with his sister Chaka, and he's killing. He's killing on this track. But to be honest with you, if we're going to talk about From the Bottom, the thing that you really have to pay attention to with this track is the tuba quartet that happens during the choruses. The brass instruments you're hearing behind Chaka singing are tubas. And one of them is the great jazz tuba player Howard Johnson. Howard Johnson has been around for decades. He's played with some of the biggest names in jazz, including Charles Mingus. In the 70s, he started to put together a group of tuba players. He called it Gravity. It was a tuba ensemble that played in front of a straight-ahead jazz rhythm section. They had a weekly residency every Sunday in New York. From what I can gather, Chaka Khan went to one of these Sunday gigs and heard this group and said, I need this group on my record. Again, we're seeing the experimental nature of the music that's being produced. By the way, Howard Johnson and Gravity are still very much together and playing now. Go look them up. Now, this was the hit on the record. It was the most popular song, even though it only made it as far as number 23 or number 22 on the Billboard chart. Once again, this is an experimental record. It's instrumentally driven, though. Right away, we hear Hugh McCracken, a name you probably know from most of the Steely Dan records. Willie Weeks is just killing this bass line. These eighth notes jump off the record. The punchiness, particularly for this song, and the brightness of it makes me feel like he probably used a jazz bass for this session. My favorite part is when they go to the bridge and Willie plays a ridiculous fill. Also of note is that this was another cover. This song was done a few years earlier in a kind of disco-fied version, and Luther Vandross, who sings backup on this, was the lead singer. If you listen really closely, right before the song starts fading out, you can hear Luther do a run right at the end. The last track, hands down, the most disco sounding of all the songs on the record. But that doesn't mean that it's not good. It's killing, especially Anthony. He created a sound back in 1973 of a bass being played with a pick and a phaser on it that no one had ever tried before, and it belongs to him. Now the funny thing is, when I was putting this video together, I overlooked the last track. Truly, trying to play through this has given me even more respect for Anthony. He's a virtuoso of the plectrum and should not be overlooked. I picked a little bass break in the middle of the song because that was actually one of the more easy parts of what he's doing. He's all over the instrument. There's a line that he's playing at the end which is particularly difficult, and I tried to grab, but if you slow it down, it looks something like this. It is harder than it looks. So why didn't this album become as successful as I believe it should have been? Well, the first reason is timing. It was released in March of 1980, which was 9 months after the disco demolition the previous year in June, and this album has the DNA of disco all over it. It's a dance album, and there are a couple of real straight-up disco tracks, and that kind of style was falling out of favor with people. And I think the timing of the album was bad. But the second reason is it was coming from an instrumental place, an older style. We hear many instruments being featured on this album, multiple guitars, horns, lush orchestration with strings, and the synthesizer is not totally present like it would become in the 80s and going ahead. So I think that people's sounds and tastes started to change, and this album somewhat represented an older time that featured more dance music with larger ensembles, and people were ready to move in a different direction, unfortunately. I still think it's one of the greatest albums of all time, and for years when I was growing up, it was never available. It was out of print. So when I got to do my first trip to Japan on tour in the late 90s, the CD at the top of my list to find was Chaka Khan's Naughty, because I knew I could find it there. And luckily, I did. Now, back in the before days, when you wanted to hear music, you actually had to pay money for a compact disc. Imagine that. Now you can probably hear this music on any streaming service, and I can't hesitate but to recommend that you go out and get it right now. Let's celebrate the brilliance of Chaka Khan and her amazing instrument, but let's also celebrate the 4 incredible bassists that contributed to this record and how incredible they made it sound. I also want to give a very special thank you to one of my students from a while back, Charlie Scott, who incidentally also makes beats for this channel. He came up with the idea for me to do an episode on Naughty because he loves that album probably as much as I do. So thanks for the idea, Charlie, and I hope you enjoy Charlie taking us out on Get Ready, Get Set. Thank you for watching the video. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate it if you click that like button. And if you're not a subscriber, what are you waiting for? If you like jazz, bass-centric content that's all original, coming at you every single week, don't hesitate. Click subscribe. Until next time, take care of yourself, and please love your neighbor.